So there are lots of directions that you could go in the study of gender. And once you start looking for gender, you see it all over the place, everywhere from art to music to science to sports to everywhere. But because this is a sociology class, we're going to go in the direction of looking at gender in terms of the social construction of gender difference and related to it and dependent on it, the social construction, the manifestation of not just difference, but actual inequality between the genders. So here's a little bit of what that's going to look like. A sociological emphasis on the study of gender focuses on the way that social institutions, whether that be families or churches or workplaces or schools or what have you, create and sustain differentiation amongst people based on ideas about gender. Now, we already talked a bit about the dominant gender myth. Gender is the system of categories which is exclusive, exhaustive, and based on physical attributes. If you think about it, when you think about the way people talk about gender instead of common everyday language, we have a lot of ways of speaking about gender that reinforce or strengthen or kind of naturalize this idea that there are two very distinct groups of people. One is called men, one is called women, and they're totally different. Um, the authors of your text talk about the whole men are from Mars, women are from Venus trope or meme or whatever you want to call it, where it's like literally there are these two planets and one has one group of people and one has another group. There's also, a little less colloquial, we often hear about opposite sexes or the opposite sex. And when you think about it, that doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense. An opposite, up is the opposite of down, um, dark is the opposite of light. If two things are opposites, that means they share nothing in common. They are completely, absolutely opposed to each other. In what sense then are men and women opposite sexes as opposed to other sexes or alternate sexes? But yet the language of opposition gives us this idea or conveys this notion that there are these two groups and they have nothing in common whatsoever, like, dark and light, high and low. So we have a lot, even in language, that tells us men and women completely different and not the same at all. In fact, they are opposite. And difference would be fine if it was just difference. But there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that suggests that gender differences actually translate into gender inequalities, in that power, privilege, status, resources have ended up disproportionately or tend to appear amongst members of one gender more so than people who are categorized as a different gender. Specifically, power, privilege, status, resources are tipped towards the group of people called men. This doesn't mean that all men are powerful and privileged and command a lot of resources and have a ton of money and all that stuff. But it does mean that if we're looking collectively, if we're looking at groups and we look at what is valued in a society, the positions of privilege, the access to wealth, all of that stuff, it tends to tip towards men as a group with a lot of individual variation. So what does that look like and how does that happen? This way in which gender difference actually manifests itself not just as difference, but as inequality. That we're going to be learning a lot about that as this course continues. A couple of important concepts here that the authors of your text are quite keen on, and they're good for you to know about. Within the myths that we have about gender, there's a couple of important things. Didn't sound very academic, important things. There's a couple of commonalities of themes that come up when we talk about the two sort of hegemonic ideas of gender, masculinity and femininity, bearing in mind that in reality, gender isn't a binary variable and there's a lot more going on. Nonetheless, we build up a lot of sort of cultural and symbolic material around masculinity and femininity. And the first of these concepts is the idea of hegemonic masculinity. And hegemonic, when we say masculinity and we put hegemonic in front, we don't mean every single thing that men do. We mean those expressions of masculinity, those forms of what another sociologist, Michael Schrock, calls manhood acts that are associated with the most privilege, the most power, the most um, deference or approval in a given society. And this is going to vary from society to society. Hegemonic masculinity is not going to look the same in Edmonton in 2021 as it did in, say, St. Petersburg in 1653. Nonetheless, a few characteristics of hegemonic masculinity that do seem to be pretty persistent are the notion of power and control. The truly masculine man, the really manly man, is the one who has power, who is able to exert his will in the world to make things happen. Extremely competent in a whole variety of areas, mainly sort of technical things of, making things occur, making things change. The notion of invulnerability. Men are not weak. They are not fragile. A real man is not a sissy or easily frightened or easily harmed. He can, just like G.I. Joe, get knocked down and get back up again and does not display vulnerabilities or weaknesses. And the third facet of hegemonic masculinity, which is associated with particularly uh, high status, is the notion of dominance. That the really manly man, the truly masculine man, is one who is not dominated by anyone else. He's not subordinated or subjected to anyone else. And in fact, he has dominance over, whether this involves showing it physically or whether this is just kind of tacit and understood, he has dominance over women. It's one reason why he's not like a woman, is because he has authority over them, and also dominance over other men. So hegemonic masculinity is not just about men being different from women or men being tougher than women or what have you. It's also about the relationships among men. Um, Societies are diverse and complex, and there are many expressions of masculinity within a given society. The hegemonically masculine man is the one who is able to, whether it's through physical force or social status or the deployment of money and resources, able to dominate other men. Now, there's no exact parallel on the feminine side of this gender binary, but the concept of emphasized femininity is one that sociologists have picked up as being um, useful, perhaps in the same way that the hegemonic masculinity is useful. And emphasized femininity, the emphasized here refers to the stress on the focus on women as individuals who exist in relation to men. Their femininity exists in relation to someone else's masculinity. And emphasized femininity is not as uh, culturally pervasive, perhaps we could say, as hegemonic masculinity is. We see a lot more people diverting, rejecting from emphasized femininity, but it's still out there as a set of ideals or ideas. Emphasized femininity refers to expressions of womanhood or girlhood, which are organized in relation to what men are presumed to want. Doesn't mean men actually do want these things. This is all about the level of sort of mythology and norms and stereotypes, not actual real living beings. Um, but emphasized femininity refers to traits and behaviors and uh, patterns of action and activity that are connected or unified by compliance with what men are presumed to be interested in and what they want. So, three facets of emphasized femininity that come up a lot in the literature are the idea of nurturance, caregiving, emotional support, all of this stuff that's often referred to as kind of soft or, sappy or touchy feely, that involves um, something similar to what a sort of idealized mother would do, this kind of care and love and sympathy and all of that falls into the emphasized femininity um, box or barrel or container, what have you. Physical attractiveness, on the presumption that men are as a group are heterosexually inclined. Emphasized femininity means a lot of concern about one's physical appearance. Do Is one living up to standards of beauty that are organized around assumptions about men, about what men want? Is one physically attractive? Can you attract or can you kind of entice a man or enable yourself to be seen as desirable by men? And finally, a sort of counterpoint to the hegemonic masculinity emphasis on invulnerability, the idea of women as and girls as fragile, easily harmed, vulnerable, precarious, in need, therefore, of protection, of defense, of chivalry on the part of men to compensate for their very feminine, their very gender normative fragility. Obviously, this does not describe a whole lot of real women who actually exist. We're talking on the level of cultural stereotypes and templates and norms when we talk about hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity. Even though these ideas don't map on to, how real men and real women really see themselves, or as well as people who don't identify as men or women, nonetheless, once you start looking for these ideas about gender essentialism and gender difference, you find them popping up everywhere. This is one of these sort of random internet joke things that's been floating around forever and ever, that you may have seen before, and you may wish to pause the narration here so you can take a look at it. It purports to be additions to the periodic table of elements. Two new elements have been discovered. One is named woman and one is named man. And they have certain physical properties, certain chemical properties, certain common uses, all of these things that if you were studying science, you'd understand in relation to elements like helium and iron and boron or whatnot. And it's done, I mean, this is meant to be funny. This is funny. That's why it circulates so much. But it's also funny because it plays off, it makes reference to a lot of the the stereotypes, the ideas, the myths that make up our dominant gender myth of men and women being totally, absolutely, completely different. Here, they're not even made of the same stuff. They're like two totally different elements. Um, Take a moment, pause this, take a look, and see if you can see any of the strands of emphasized femininity or hegemonic masculinity as you're reading through these traits and characteristics that supposedly men have and women have. In distinction to what these sort of cliched ideas about gender difference would have us believe, when we actually measure and count, when sociologists go do all these, surveys and experiments and observations that they do and so forth, and look at differences between men and women, actual patterns of differences don't look like Mars and Venus. Actual patterns of differences look kind of like as you're looking on the right hand side of your screen, they look kind of like this chart, which you may recognize as a normal distribution, where the means in the middle are high, and then you have whatever it is you're measuring kind of tailing off on the low end and on the high end. So if one of these lines represents the distribution of, let's just pick something randomly, mechanical aptitude among men, and the other represents the distribution of mechanical aptitude, let's say, among women, the group means might be slightly different. You might see one group on average is higher on a certain attribute than another group. But what's more important than a slight difference in means is the amount of area here outlined in red. In statistical terms, we call that, what's under the line, what's under the overlap. The area there where there's really not a noticeable or a meaningful difference between individuals in those two groups. So you'll have lots of individuals in the higher mean group who are lower on whatever attribute it may be than many individuals in the lower mean group, and the reverse also being true. What we see for almost every attribute you can measure is that there's much more variability within gender groups. If you're comparing, let's say, men and women, there's much more variation amongst a group of men or amongst a group of women than there is if you put these two groups up against each other and compare women versus men between the two groups. And those of you who've done stats, you're probably thinking, about analysis of variation, and you may be remembering some of what you've learned about that. The important thing here is that on almost every attribute within group variation, the amount, the dispersion, the spread of an attribute within a group is greater than the difference between groups if we look at means or averages. So men and women, Mars and Venus, that doesn't really work. Lots of overlap under the curve for no matter what it is you're measuring. That actually works a whole lot better. So if that's the way things actually fall out, that there's much more within group variation than between group variation, how is it that our social institutions reproduce inequality and difference so much? How is it that nonetheless we see men, for instance, on average, earning much higher incomes than other people? How is it that we find women, again, on average, picking up more unpaid work, doing more of the invisible household work than people who are not women? And that's what we're going to be looking at. That's what we're going to be getting into in the weeks to come. Before we get down to the sort of brass tacks of school, family, workplace, and so forth, and what's going on there, we'll look at a few different perspectives on gender or ways of approaching the study of gender. For today, I'm just going to leave you with a group of images. Again, take a moment and see if you can see what's going on there in terms of gender. And I hope this will leave you with the sense or with the awareness that once you start looking for gender, you start seeing it everywhere you go. And if by the end of this semester, if you're starting to see gender everywhere you go, then I can think, okay, yeah, this course achieved what we wanted it to achieve, and I've done what I wanted to do. So that's it for this week, and we'll see you next week.